And now with our fourth presenter, Professor Vanessa Rubio-Marquez. Professor Rubio-Marquez is the Associate Dean for the Extended Education for the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. She had a 25-year-long career in Mexico's public service, including serving as a senator and as a 3-time deputy minister. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Rubio-Marquez.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jomna. And I would like to thank also Dan Negri, our Senior Director, and the rest of the team from the Freedom and Prosperity Center. It is a pleasure to be here with you today and together with my co-panelists. So basically, what I did on the paper I am presenting today is I used the case of Mexico to make a point basically on two elements. First, the relevance of the Freedom and Prosperity Index to find a series of comparable elements, as we have seen here today in the cases already for Egypt and India, and more broadly on the conclusions that Vladimir reached out in terms of the correlation on freedom and prosperity. So that is a very valuable tool in order to explore freedom and prosperity being mutually determinant, but also larger elements in terms of each of the components of the index and how they interact. But moreover, what I also think is relevant is to consider that when we amplify and when we deepen with qualitative information, this index and freedom and prosperity index, we find, or we might find a lot more to what is happening in terms of the trends of particularly what is going on in a specific group of countries that have been building more and more each time in the world in relation to those characterized as mostly free and mostly prosperous in the context of global democratic retrenchment. So this is the case that I want to present to you today. The next, please. So I use the case of Mexico to make a point, basically portrayed in this picture, which is the light part and the front part of that building would be the mostly free and the mostly prosperous categorization under the Freedom and Prosperity Index. But you will have in that picture very evident, very clear, very transparent, and very bright even picture or portrait of a characterization of a specific country. But in the back, there is something else happening that we need to learn about. So it's about history, it's about foundations, but very importantly about the current trends and what is underneath of those elements of institutional contexts in many of the countries characterized as mostly free and mostly prosperous. So finding out some features that are less evident, and I think what is happening today in Mexico is a very relevant case to portray what is happening in other places, as I mentioned, in the context of democratic retrenchment. So what is happening underneath, beyond the surface, we should be also understanding, not only in the context of democratic backsliding, but how democratic backsliding is affecting both key elements of the index. In the one hand, freedom, and in the other hand, prosperity, and the correlation between them. So since the year I used to define as the changing year in terms of this explanation of what is going on behind the index, the year I chose is 2018 in Mexico, because in 2018 in Mexico, we had a change of government, a change of regime, that is making a series of changes in terms of democratic consolidation that had been going on in Mexico. And what I portray here is the way these democratic changes and this democratic backsliding is having an effect on both freedom and prosperity. So what I want to give you in the next slide is a bit of history of the way in which several elements that constitute the multidimensional measurement of poverty have been moving since the year 2000 up until the year 2018. So what was going on in Mexico before that year, mainly prosperity-wise, in relation to the various elements of the multidimensional poverty index. So as you might know, Mexico was the first country to introduce the multidimensional measurement of poverty, which not only speaks about the threshold in terms of income. In our case, we divided into rural income and urban income, but also across a series of lack of access to social rights, which are basically food and nutrition in the first place, health, social security, housing and services to housing. And when we speak about services to housing, it's basically electricity, sewage, the construction itself of the housing, and overcrowding. So what is portrayed here in this evolution from 2000 until 2018, where the cut I make starts, is, and this is evaluated by an independent technical institution called Coneval, which is mandated by the law to do this evaluation on social policy and social policy in relation to poverty and extreme poverty in particular, and social lacks. It's basically the evolution. For instance, I will underline from 2000 until 2018, health lack in Mexico moved from 58.6% to 16.2%. So huge advance there. Still, as I always say, when you take the picture, even if in 2018, with all this positive evolution in several of the factors here, you're still speaking about millions of people that have a lack of access to a series of elements of social rights. So it's never a finished task. You always, as the SDGs motto mentioned, you should leave no one behind, and until those numbers are very much reduced and inequalities in the access to these social services is reduced at large, then we can speak about a change of structural panorama. But these changes are relevant. So health moved again from 58.6 to 16.2% in this period, 2018, but also, for instance, sewage, one of the services to housing, moved from a lack of 40% of the population to a lack of 6.3% of the population. And another one that I would like to highlight from that chart is basically electricity. So the lack of electricity in Mexico in the year 2000 affected 13% of the population, and then by 2018 it was 0.4%. So this is part of the measurement of the multidimensional measurement of poverty in Mexico that is portrayed in the study, but basically is taking into account the evolution in terms of access to social rights and access to a series of social elements and social services that put us now in the moment where I situate the working paper, which is the change of government in 2018. So next one, please. So what happened here is that, of course, there was not everything, not all the problems were solved up until 2018. There were basically elements in relation to corruption scandals, to huge inequalities yet in the country, and a culture of privilege that all of these three elements were basically the reason why many voters decided to change the regime, to give their vote by a landslide to the current president. But what we also need to take stock of is that there were a series of other evolutions in terms of freedom and prosperity that could actually, it was easily, we could easily characterize Mexico up to 2018 as a mostly free, mostly prosperous country. But then the change came into 2018, and where there were high expectations, perhaps more in the terms of prosperity and the reduction of poverty and the poor having a voice and being able to move out of this circumstance, where a series of changes took place that have us in the current circumstance that I think is worth noting and is worth giving further analysis in terms of the nuances, in terms of the elements behind the index today, that not only take a picture of the current state of the situation in a certain country, but what is building behind it and what features we can identify, especially in terms of institutional deterioration and institutional weakening, as in the context of democratic retrenchment, that is having very specific effects on the freedom elements and the prosperity elements in the country as a whole. No, so next one, please. So what I look into in detail in terms of the paper is into 6 elements. First of all, the great uncertainty that has been created in terms of private sector certainty and private sector participation in the economy, and that being a determinant of investment, and that being a determinant of growth creation, and that being a determinant of the lack of economic growth in the country. Whereas prior to 2018, the average growth in the last 6 years was 2.3%. We're basically reaching almost no growth since that time. Of course, we had the COVID crisis in 2020 and 2021, but still, even before that, the first year of results, 2019, there was a reduction in growth of minus 0.2%. So one of the elements behind this effect on growth, and growth being quite linked, and growth being a prerequisite for prosperity and for a better distribution of resources in an economy, basically there was one decision that had an initial effect on this investment retrenchment in Mexico, and that was the cancellation of the largest infrastructure project in the country, which was the airport, the international airport, that would, of course, would bring not only tourism and business and exponential benefits for development in a country which is the 15th largest economy in the world out of 194 countries. So this meant, the cancellation of this project meant a lost opportunity. The costs of that cancellation have been estimated in $6.6 billion, but they also reach, in terms of reputational costs and, of course, the counterfactual scenario, you can easily go to double that, so around $12 billion US dollars in terms of costs for that cancellation. But as I was mentioning, it was also a reputational cost that has been taking a hit on basically fixed gross investment in Mexico, that has been significantly reduced. And also in the context of these geopolitical trends of nearshoring, friendshoring, ally-shoring, and Mexico being the second largest trading partner of the United States, what there is a missed opportunity to create more growth, more prosperity, better jobs in the economy. But this was just the beginning of a series of policies in relation to the reaction of the government vis-a-vis the private sector and the environment in Mexico in relation to welcoming and giving assurances and giving certainty to the private sector in terms of investment. So we have thus not been able to reap the benefits of this new context of the nearshoring processes that is taking in the world, or not in the magnitude that we could have been doing that in the last few years. The second element that I wanted to underline is basically the capture of institutions. And the capture of institutions that has been taking place in this context is basically, in the first hand, it's the budgetary constraints. So how do you capture an institution when you are not in favor of independent institutions, of technical institutions, of autonomous institutions? You basically cut their budget, in the context of a narrative of austerity, particularly due to COVID crisis and what came afterward, the subsequent context. But it's basically, in the first hand, the reduction of a budget for those institutions. Then the next one is how do you interfere with the decision-making process of those institutions? By appointing loyals to the decision-making bodies, which basically affect the governance of those institutions, and which imply also a significant hit to the independence and to the otherwise checks and balances in terms of technical institutions and autonomous institutions in the country, not only those, for instance, that determine elements as economic competition, but also those who regulate, for instance, the energy sector. So that's another element that we have also had in the past. And in relation to this, also we have basically also been experiencing a series of attacks to the other two powers. The other two powers being the legislative and the judiciary. That have been taking a toll in terms of the freedom in the country, but also the checks and balances, the very relevant democratic checks and balances that are in place constitutionally, but that in practice have been shattered by this new feature of the Mexican political system. Another element that I would point in terms of democratic retrenchment and the way this has affected Mexico in many ways in the current administration, it's basically the militarization of otherwise civil activities in the country. So you will find now the army taking care of public security, customs, infrastructure building, operation of an airport, building an oil refinery, building and equipping social banks, and most recently, even in charge of the security of Mexico City underground. And just to give you an order of magnitude, 6,000 elements of the army were recently deployed to be in charge of the security of the metro, of the Mexico City's underground. When you have specific states in Mexico with huge challenges in terms of security, mainly derived from organized crime, that have less than 5,000 elements of the military, of the army. So again, it's another trend, another feature that, in terms of the picture that I showed to you at the beginning, it's behind the elements, and sometimes they're hidden elements that, in the one hand, you might see that according to a series of indicators, you can do the checklist and see that they are fulfilling the freedom thresholds. But when you do a deeper qualitative analysis, there is a trend that is building in terms of weakening those institutions and weakening the rule of law and weakening democratic checks and balances, which are essential elements of freedom, and of course determine the degree of prosperity of a country. And also there has been another element which has been in relation to freedom of expression. And that is a permanent attack in the rhetoric, but also in the daily press conferences from the presidential daily press conferences, that basically directly attack media representatives, private sector representatives, civil society, academia, and opposition leaders from the highest pulpit in the country, which is the executive daily conferences. So this is also an element that again is building up against freedom of expression, and we should complement the index with this qualitative data and analysis that is worth looking as a trend, no? And basically, and with this I will end, because I think I am over the 15 minutes already, but it's basically pure and simple bad policy as a result of an engaging not from a rigorous information and rigorous planning, but rather ideology and preconceptions and biases and magical thinking that is basically one of the characteristics of populistic leaders, of authoritarian regimes, of autocratic regimes. And again, I think that all of the elements that are portrayed and analyzed in the paper that I present today is a form of understanding the nuances and a form of understanding additional qualitative information in terms of, in this case, this democratic retrenchment trend that is being experienced in Mexico, but is also being experienced in the larger context of polarization, populism, and democratic retrenchment in several parts of the world. So I wanted to give a different view, a different perspective on a series of qualitative data that are very relevant to see if we want to create an early warning system as to when a country might change in terms of status, being in this case mostly free and mostly prosperous, but sometimes with a question mark in terms of the trend in which this is heading. So with this, I end, and I thank you for your attention.